Hello students. So this is the third video and we're going to talk about the actual reading. So what I did is I assigned you to read Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Case for Reparations. It's out of the Atlantic and it's from June 2014 issue. And basically we follow the life of Clyde Ross and his family as he goes. They talk about some of the discrimination that he and his family experienced in Mississippi, some of the dealing with racism at the hands of the white authorities, and even they stole the family horse. He couldn't go to school. They didn't have, he had an opportunity to go to school, but they didn't have a bus that he could take, even though white students had a bus. And so he's just dealing with discrimination down in Mississippi. Then he goes off to fight in the war, and he went to had gone to California. He saw that there wasn't any racism in California, and he goes back down south, and he experiences racism. And then he decides to move with his family. They decide to move to Chicago, as many blacks did, and they reference the book Warmth of Another Sun. I know Professor Taylor, Ed Taylor, is always talking about that book by Isabel Wilkerson. So there's discussions of that. And so they talked about how there was just a mass exodus of black folk going from the south to the north, thinking that there's going to be better opportunities, and there are some better opportunities as far as some job opportunities, but we see from reading the material they still are dealing with racism. And as I've talked about in the other video, they talk about some of the key concepts. I'm going to go over these again because they're going to be in your essay, the assignment that I give you. So some of the core concepts that we talk about, they talk about a kleptocracy when he's down south, which is basically it's a government with corrupt leaders that use their powers to exploit the people and natural resources of their own territory in order to extend their personal wealth and political power. So specifically, he talks about that experience with the Clyde Ross family when they're down south, and how they're kind of caught up and tricked into the sharecropping process. And then he also talks about it when they go into Chicago, how they experience that. He talks specifically when the family moves to Chicago, how they have to deal with restrictive covenants, which is a covenant imposing a restriction on the use of land so that the value and enjoyment of adjoining land will be preserved. So basically, when they talk in the case for reparations, he talks about how they were like, they don't want to have they didn't want to have black folks moving in or other foreign folk moving in, because they were arguing, oh, that could bring down the value of the property. And they talk about redlining, the systematic denial of various services to residents of specific, often racially associated neighborhoods or communities, either directly or through the selective raising of prices. And so they talked specifically about, even though they had the federal government was supposed to come in and put certain protections in place for federal housing, that actually wasn't bearing out for the black experience, that they, that there were crooked mortgage companies or realtors that were basically, in the article he talks about how you had people, some white folk basically, that would buy property for really cheap, and then they'd sell it to a black family. They'd mark up the price like 3 times. And if the person missed a payment, they would kick them out, even though they may have made years and years of payments, and then they would move on to the next black victim. And they were talking about how there were supposed to be protections in place on the local, state level, and even federal level, but that didn't really bear out, and that black folks were discriminated against. And he talks in the article about the promise of a home ownership, how Clyde Ross, he had been in the South and experienced racism and discrimination in terms of job opportunities and housing. And then he gets up north, and he wants to go with the American dream that they talk about. And they talk about Roosevelt and a New Deal and all the wonderful programs that came out through Roosevelt, but how even with Roosevelt, there still were some Jim Crow policies in place that affected Black folks. There was also discussion about, there was a author that did the GI Bill and talked about discrimination that Black veterans would experience when they go fight and come back, and then they try to get housing, and they experience discrimination from the government rather, with dealing with the GI Bill. And he talked about HR 40. So HR 40, how that was initially, every year, how it was introduced by our Congressman, former Congressman John Conyers, and I've talked about this in the previous video, how that was introduced by Sheila Jackson Lee in January of 2019, and that's the Commission for a Study for Reparations for African Americans. In the article, he talks about situations where there's a Black woman, she's worked for years, she was a slave, and she sued her slave master's estate, and she prevailed. And they also talked about the Quakers, how the Quakers, they were feeling guilty about what they did, and how there were times that they did start trying to give reparations to Black folks. They talked about the general conversation, though, that from the beginning of the country till the present, that there's just generally been a sentiment of unwillingness to give mass reparations to Black people as a whole. And then even though he talks about the atrocities that Africans experience at the hand of being slaves in America, and being raped, being murdered, being brutalized, being lynched, even he doesn't just talk about slavery, he talks about discrimination in the South and the lynching that occurs post-slavery, like Jim Crow laws, black codes. And then he talks about discrimination that occurs in the 1950s and the 1970s, all the way up to the present. He talks about the issues as far as that there are 1 million Black people locked up in the prison industrial complex, that there's still issues. He goes from the history of us from 1619 all the way up to the present, talking about the issues, the discrepancies when it comes to Black folks as far as housing, education, employment, all of those issues. So he very thoroughly talks about that in the case for reparations. And he talks about how Clyde Ross, they get together, they have a group that they form, and they sue and for the housing discrimination in Chicago, and that one of the jurors says some real racist stuff about we thought this, we thought we had resolved this in the past with some of our, decisions. And he basically it was like a quote saying something about he wanted to make up for the Warren Court and the decision from Brown versus Board of Education, which, as you know, we've read Brown versus Board of Education, that went against Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson was saying separate but equal, and then Brown versus Board of Education said separate but equal was unconstitutional. And so there's discussion about what he does, how Clyde Ross and his wife, he has multiple jobs, he's slaving away, but still has to deal with combat with housing discrimination and just dealing with that issue. And then this is the juror in his case. It says the contract buyers league suit brought by Clyde Ross and his allies took direct aim at the inheritance. The suit was rooted in Chicago's long history of segregation, which had created two housing markets, one legitimate and backed by the government, the other lawless and patrolled by predators. The suit dragged on until 1976, when the league lost a jury trial. Securing the equal protection of the law proved hard. Securing reparations proved impossible. If there were any doubts about the mood of the jury, the foreman removed them by saying, when asked about the verdict, that he hoped it would help in the mess Earl Warren made with Brown versus Board of Education and all that nonsense. So, I mean, this is 1976. It's not too long ago. And you still had dealing with racism. And so he goes through that in the article and talks about the discrepancies with, if even Black folk that have maybe make 100,000 a year will still live in neighborhoods in poor communities than white folks that are similarly situated. So he talks about that, and it's just a very in-depth argument for reparations. So, and you just see, actually there's some parallels here with this article and the article that I had you guys read from Nicole Hannah-Jones. So he references NCOBRA in this article, which I said I would have you guys, would reference for you all. And NCOBRA is a group, it's the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, is an organization based out of Washington that seeks financial compensation for descendants of former slaves in the United States. And it advocates that the U.S. government, U.S. corporations, and individuals who benefited from the labors of former slaves should pay reparations of an undisclosed amount, and say that further study needs to be done to find the exact amount, but estimate the amount to be approximately $8 trillion. Members of the NCOBRA seek reparations because of the many injuries caused from slavery and the continuing effect it has had upon the Black race. These reparations can take many forms, including economic development and other monetary resources. Based on the estimated U.S. population for 2008, this amount to approximately 205,000 per Black citizen in the United States. The group also seeks an apology from the entire white race. So that's NCOBRA. And then there's another group that's in the video that I provided for you. It's that's that group that's called NARC, and they also talk about it comes from a lot. It's a group comprised of a lot of professionals that also call for reparations for Black folk. I will probably just go ahead and send that to you all so that you can have that information. And so I am going to be giving you an essay to do and on reparations, and I have some questions that I've laid out. So you want to, basically the main source for the essay that I'm providing, you're going to need to read, if you haven't already done so, The Case for Reparations. Read over the HR 40, look at the videos that I provided, and just make sure you read the question and answer it. And, you know, I'll go over some of the things some of the things I've already talked about, like what is a kleptocracy, and how does Ta-Nehisi Coates define it? How were the majority of the people in Jim Crow Mississippi the victims of kleptocracy? I'm saying Black folk. How were Mississippi Black farmers the victims of kleptocracy? So some things like that. So just be mindful of the questions and read the question and make sure you just answer the question in the essay. And this is a pretty in-depth topic dealing with reparations. And so, you know, I just say read the materials, specifically answer the questions that I provide. And also, you know, I'm giving you latitude to have some creativity. Come up with, if you have some creative ideas of how you think reparations can be accomplished for African Americans, share it. Who knows? I mean, I have, we had Mama Joanne Watson, who's a member of NCOBRA. She came to speak we had our Black lawyers group in Washtenaw County brought her out, and we invited the public, which we often do. You know, knowledge is power. Everybody needs to be educated. And we had a very in-depth discussion about reparations and about her work that she's done as an activist and crusader for justice. And so just read the material and provide your reflections. And again, I just ask that you all remember to keep safe, look after yourselves. You know, a lot of people are talking about doing things to boost your immunity and practice social distancing. And just let me know if you need anything. And so peace and blessings, and I'll talk with you later.